You are listening to Methods Build What's Next Digital Product Perspectives, presented by Global Logic. At Method, we aim to bridge the gap between technology and humanity for a more seamless digital future. Join us as we uncover insights, best practices, and cutting-edge technologies with top industry leaders that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Build What's Next. I'm your host today, Jason Rome, Head of Solutions for Method. Really excited about my guest today and the conversation that we're about to have. Jon Webster, who's joining us, I'll have him introduce in a second, but Jon and I have gotten to know each other over the past couple of years, and probably some of the most mentally gymnastic, challenging, thought-provoking conversations I have had in my entire career. So I think this may be the first podcast where there's not only a bibliography, but potentially a footnotes section based on the amount of academic research and conversations that Jon has had. So really excited. We're going to tackle today, everyone's excited about AI. Everyone's excited about LLMs. I think Jon and I are going to tackle really the forefront of where that is and looking at the intersection of LLMs, organizational design, and complex thinking. Jon and I both spend time in this space, Jon from an investment management perspective and myself from thinking about how product teams can change how they're making decisions about company strategy. So really excited looking at the limitations of the current system and how organizations can leverage that. Jon, welcome. If you don't mind, maybe give a little bit of background on you and the topic we're going to talk about.
Yeah, no, great, Jason. Thank you so much. That's quite an intro. Footnotes and academic. So, Jon Webster, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of CPP Investments. And maybe if I sort of just introduce the Canada Pension Plan, it really is, I think, one of Canada's great success stories. $114 billion invested at home in Canada, over 714 billion AUM globally. We're a global investment organization, and we invest the CPP fund for the next quarter century, so not the next quarter, to help create retirement security for future generations of Canada. And what really sets us apart is our long-term investment horizon, and certainty of assets, and our sort of singular mission. In terms of the topic today, I think we view artificial intelligence as a really dynamic and emerging business opportunity and risk. And as an organization, it's really important to us to explore how we can leverage generative AI capabilities and broader AI capabilities to deliver the best outcomes for the CPP fund. So at the heart of, I think, everything we'll talk about today is a sort of almost a singular question, which is, will it make us a better investor? So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, and with CPP, obviously, I'm grateful because part of my company journey, we are, Global Logic, a success story from the portfolio as well. So, jumping in, I think some of the research right now is, and some of the debates that happen are around, how actually intelligent is LLMs or are LLMs, and I think also, does it matter? Because I think there's a debate of LLMs can achieve these amazing feats and seem like they are extremely intelligent, but there's a debate on, are we going to achieve general intelligence? How intelligent are they? I guess a two-part question in your thoughts here, Jon, of, does it matter how intelligent they are compared to the outcomes you're seeing? And, as you've been exploring the space, maybe what's kind of surprised you about where they're able to help, but then we'll start to drift towards what are the limitations that we see, especially in a complex space like that which you're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great place to start. I mean, I have this presentation and I start with a few pictures. I start with a picture of Yann LeCun, I think probably back in 2024, saying, LLMs are as intelligent as a cat. And then Jeff Hinton, maybe about a month or so ago, saying you're going to have to be super smart for them to not to be able to do what you do. And then you've got like two economists, Nobel Prize winner, one from Stanford, who, again, completely opposite ends of the spectrum. One saying, I think a huge amount of money is going to be wasted. Only 5% of what people do is going to be, impacted by this. And then, another one saying it's the most impactful thing that we've ever seen. I think in some sense at this point in time, it's the wrong question. It's not a question of whether it's intelligent, it's whether it's useful. And then it's a question of, can it do what you do? Can you make it do what you want it to do? How far and fast will it go? And how's it going to impact your value chain? So I would come back to like just the real essence of Anytime you're making a decision about the deployment of particularly technology, and I would accept actually this is a different technology. It will have agency in the sense of being able to do things and make choices in some sense to do things, which technology hasn't had before. But at the heart of it, you've got to sort of understand what you do and how this applies to what you do. And I think a lot of the conversations are getting sort of tied up in the sort of existential about is it intelligent or not, yeah, and actually not back to is it fundamentally useful. And then what do you do? Well, then you have to kind of study the nature of the technology and sort of dig into it. And at the heart of it, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we go through, given the conversations we've had, Jason. You go back to what was the nature of the fundamental technology underneath this, right? The transformer was about actually language and translation of languages. And actually, I come back to a very simple, perspective from a sort of economic and sort of, I guess, technological and sociological perspective, which is actually language is what holds a lot of value chains together. The specialization of language, the generalization of language, the impact that has on communication costs in the value chain. Much like the internet changed parts of the communication costs between parts of the value chain, so does language have a specific effect on that. And I think if you really want to dig into what it might do to value chains, to industries, you start there. And then, of course, there's been a huge amount of progress in the last 2 or 3 years, layering on capabilities on top of that. But get back to the question, is it useful?
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. And we're going to definitely talk value chains today. And, where are we putting AI into our value chains versus where do we need to reconfigure them? But then also, I think to your point, LLMs sometimes force us to question how strong of a grasp we have on our value chain in the first place. Just thinking about some of the conversations I'm having right now, more on the use of LLMs for the software development lifecycle, some with PEs and their portcos, some with not, saying, hey, we're seeing developers become more efficient, but our costs haven't gone down and we're not shipping any more software. So what gives here? And so I think the importance there, to your point of, and something that you like to think about, which is, LLMs are gonna help us remove our mundane tasks, but just because we have a mundane task doesn't mean it impacts our entire value stream, and being able to think about that. And I think that's one of the early things and that I'm seeing is a lot of our AI projects are business process reengineering and cultural reexaminations hiding in the guise of an AI automation project. And so, getting into some of those limitations and where it's useful, where it's not, I think we can all definitely say at this point, there are a lot of tasks that can be automated. Where we have highly repetitive, content-rich type tasks, AI is going to outperform us, just like the calculator outperforms us at math pretty easily there. But then we get into this other space. And one of the things that you talk about is this concept of the generator-verifier gap, and being one of the fundamental limitations of how LLMs will be applied in a complex theoryless domain, if you will. So talk a little bit about kind of the theories within domains and also what the generator-verifier gap is and how you got to that point.
Yeah, I think some of this comes from, as you start to, just think in your practical everyday usage of it. Yeah. I remember the first time, well, actually, as first time, it makes it sound like it's eons ago. The first time I ran a deep research report, maybe that was like, 4 months ago or something.
Yeah.
Like
feels like
forever.
Ago. Yeah.
It still feels like forever. And you get an output and you're like, actually, that looks pretty good. Yeah, give me a scenario on something unfolding, and then from an economic perspective, maybe over the next 5-10 years, and you get something which is, range of scenarios ranging from the plausible to the possible. You get actually quite a rich perspective on, all the factors that are unfolding, and then you look at actually some of your own work and some thinking you've done around it. And you're like, I'm not actually sort of sure I can tell the difference between these two things.
Yeah.
And that for me is where sort of the verification part comes in. Actually, so actually. Some things have no answer at this point in time. Yeah. So some things will unfold over time and are hard to verify. And typically in investing, many of the things that we deal with unfold over time. From the time you start the idea to the time the results, all sorts of things have happened in the world, all sorts of things have happened in the investment, all sorts of things have happened in the company. And what turns out in reality might have been very different. And that sort of verification stage from your sort of initial idea to the results, is genuinely in the sort of, it's complex. It's unfolded very differently than you thought. So I think, so that's like one thing to sort of hold. At the other end, you've got like just the classics of reinforcement learning with like a verified signal, where you are straightforward into if I've got some, genuine way of guiding the reinforcement learning with a verified outcome, I can actually get, machines to do a bunch of stuff really, really reliably. And that's not the domain actually that sort of investing lives in to begin with. We're back in this hard to verify space. So then I think you've really got to think about what's the nature of, if you like, the work we're trying to do. And actually a lot of research is, or sort of investment is exploration to begin with. First of all, actually, you're going to explore many ideas. And actually, part of being a great investor is, by definition, if you need to have a contrarian perspective on the market in order to sort of do something other than the market would have naturally done. So now you need to actually hold heterodox beliefs as opposed to just the orthodox belief. And I think that's a great place where generative AI in particular can actually really bring something different than you're able to do today. Actually, the ability to explore many parallel perspectives, that sort of ensemble effect of looking at many alternative theories about how things might unfold, is a beautiful place for generative AI to play. You don't need to be worried about, the precise facts and figures of 3.4% and 5%. You're dealing with broad possibilities to, I think, really inform. So that's like one space I think is like, brilliantly ripe. I think then the other part I think about, probably less to do with the sort of verifiability, but more to do with actually how does every value chain evolve? And every value chain evolves through, it's a gigantic computation. Making a pencil is a gigantic computation across a huge supply chain. And actually, many of those supply chains are, not just the things that go in our head, they're real physical things. You've got to dig stuff out of the ground, have factories, move things around. But actually investing is a lot of, research, a lot of information processing, a lot of thinking, and then a lot of how our processes have evolved, in a sense, are down to the computational constraints of us as human beings. And if those computational constraints are really changed by working with the machine together, I think we can imagine very different ways of doing our work. So I sort of hold those two things, like, how can we use the technology to reduce the computational constraints? How do we think about what is verifiable, what isn't verifiable, and use those to sort of guide where we use the technology?
Yeah, it's a really interesting examination, and I think a lot of things to unpack there, and even going back to knowledge, but thinking about even the prompt you mentioned of show me all these different scenarios, I think illustrates one thing that you and I've talked about, which is, it's no longer about having the answers. It's about asking the right questions. And one of the quotes that I've stolen from you and repeated many times is, the importance of being able to separate your ego from accuracy, because I think there's a certain intellectual maturity in that exploration of being able to hold multiple potential beliefs in your mind at once and not kind of committing to one needing to be true, versus going and asking the LLM, give me the most likely scenario, or give me the answer to this question, versus show me alternatives, show me things that are counterintuitive to my thinking. I know personally, one of the things that I've done when I'm using the tool is, two things. I give it something or a conclusion or something I've written. I say, tell me what might be wrong about this. Like, critique this, show me what's wrong. Or the second is, I'll give it something, and then I'll say, hey, interview me where my ideas are sparse, and force me to go deeper, like force me to continue to do the critical thinking. And one of the key things there for me, looking at some data this week on this, prepping for this, was, there's some early studies, in the product development space, for example, where, senior product managers, they gain productivity increase and they maintain the quality of their deliverables. Junior team members gain productivity but lose quality of their deliverables. And then another study, which I think the results are still emerging, to your point, there's everyone on every spectrum here of, the use of LLMs inhibiting creative thinking for certain individuals. So I think there's this real delicate balance of, LLMs are an all-purpose tool, but there is going to be so much empowerment and difference in how strong you are at thinking about thinking and bringing those in and asking the right question, which isn't something that we're always building into our value chains really well because we're trying to move things forward. So I think in the thought space like you're in, where you're constantly doing something new, and it reminds me how a lot of back testing models don't work, right? Because as soon as you put a new model out into the universe, it starts changing the ecosystem that it's working within. So that fundamental challenge of how do you use LLMs when there's potentially not a right answer and you're trying to use them to help you get the right answer, but change how you're thinking and change how that impacts your value chain is really interesting. With that, you know, I want to go back to something else you said about language, because I think that's another really key thing. Can you unpack, you know, how you see LLMs changing that dependency on language in our value chains a little bit? Because I think that's one of the fundamental points that I think got us to this point in the conversation.
Yeah, so this could go on a bit. You said it was going to have footnotes and a sort of theory warning, so let's go, right. So I think I went back to like when LLMs came out, I was amazed. I had some proper aha moments. I thought this is just transformative, and I remain of that conviction today, recognizing there's places where it's still not appropriate to use, but there are many places to use. So you go back to where there are lots of theories about the emergence of language, but one I guess intuitively like, maybe there's a bias in here, is actually it was all about trying to keep things secret. So if you could just like physically copy what I did, and I found something that was really cool, then you could just watch what I did. You could copy it. There's no advantage for me. So if there were little subtle parts of what I did that needed communication with you to sort of transmit those so you could learn how to do it, I suddenly could hold on to my advantage. So if you buy the idea that language actually, part of the selection pressure was to keep things secret, you can sort of get to a view of, isn't that why legal people speak legalese, technology people speak technology, different flavors of technologies people speak different flavors of technology, tax people speak tech, because actually it's part of keeping our part of the value chain to us and part of that specialism. Now, there's knowledge in there as well. So it's not, you can't just be an empty content box, just having a language, but sort of, nothing inside that box. But actually, when you look at how value chains form, they do actually form quite a lot around specialized and generalized knowledge. Yeah. So you can then start from perspective, if there is a machine that can sort of help you understand those sort of business dialects or any form of dialect differently, you might legitimately say, well, actually, I can imagine how that would start to weaken the forces in the value chain. Yeah, so for the sort of theorists, if you're in software, you'll talk about Conway's law a lot. There's a sort of extension of that called the mirroring hypothesis, which runs across many scales. And in effect, we end up with this sort of very niche-y, supplier-provider ecosystem. People who do credit by credit systems, people that do private equity by private equity systems, people that do real assets want to work with other people that know real assets in operations. And that's actually a large part of what keep the value chain together. So I think an important part of what's happening, I think you're already seeing it with LLMs, is they're starting to weaken some of those forces in the value chain. That mirroring perspective is really strong, so it won't sort of dissolve overnight. So I think that's one part of what you should think about as you're considering these things. I think the second part is just, go back to what LLMs have been trained on, right? So you can run experiments. Right? So I've done this. You run an experiment, say, I want some great questions. I'm in a board discussion. I know there's going to be sort of, genuinely testing questions. I want to have a view of what are those sorts of testing questions on the topic I'm presenting. You run that in almost in any LLM and you'll get a good high quality set of questions out of it. If you happen to know who the board members are, and then sort of put in, I've got board member X, he or she, this person, and run the same query, you'll likely get actually a much worse set of questions. And then you're sort of like, well, what's going on then? You've got an intuition, right? Which is the training data for board questions is high quality. You can go to the strategic, the Institute of Directors. You can go to people that sort of advise boards, and they'll publish the sorts of questions board members will ask. You've got a sense of high quality training data in there. So what you're getting reflected back at you is probably a reasonably high quality reflection of the high quality training data. You do that with like a specific name board member, you've got some weak representation. They found a news article or something else. So you've got like just this less good perspective.
Yeah.
Then you go further and you think, well, okay, well, aren't there like really many great ways of thinking about problems that I don't know? Yeah, there are many great thinking frameworks out there. You may have read, I mean, I read a lot of books. I like Roger Martin. I like his Where to Play, How to Win book. I read it probably for the first time 10 years ago. I was like, I'm absolutely going to use this in my strategic thinking. And then the number of times I used the Where to Play, How to Win framework after that was probably broadly zero. Yeah, until LLMs came along. And I was like, I wonder if it knows where to play, how to win. Turns out it does know where to play, how to win. Yeah. Now it knows doesn't know it like Roger Martin knows where to play, how to win, I'm sure, but it does know a reasonably good version of it. And if I ask it questions about, I've been thinking about this strategic question, could you help me use this thinking framework? Well, actually, I start to get something pretty interesting. So I talk a lot about like heuristics, because our heuristics are the sort of human version of the algorithms that we used in all thinking problems. And sometimes people have fantastically well-developed heuristics that they built through time over expertise. Sometimes we have weak heuristics in domains we don't know very well. And I think you can see people who use LLMs really well, thinking hard about how they dial into a way of thinking, a frame of reference that actually is additive already to what they do. And then you have the bonus, of course, that there's just a great big knowledge base. And then with some of the sort of tooling that's coming along, like with deep research and web search, now you're able to bring those thinking frameworks, yours and the machines, together with a big knowledge base. And then I think you start to open up a whole bunch of possibilities. And I think that's stuff that you can, in a sense, reason out about how you should use it today. And then you can start to think about, well, what's going to come next?
So, I mean, I think that hits on a couple key, beliefs that you and I had when we started exploring this space. One was that, we can create a better data set to get a better average. So there's what any one person knows, there's what the internet knows, which is what these bots have been trained on. And then there's what the experts know that is probably better than the average. The second thing was, once we understand what this looked like, we can probably start to extend that and train people to think better, not just to know the answers, but shape their thinking a little bit better. And then the third thing being that probably starts to unlock abilities to reduce waste and accelerate value in a complex thought-oriented value chain. Is that a fair way to kind of summarize how to think about that?
I think that's the right way. I mean, I think, if you start with, I used, the example of like lots of great thinking frameworks that are well researched. These are really, there's a reason why they're hard. We read the books and then we don't use them because they're cognitively hard to use. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they require us to rewire our practices. Actually, we have to go and practice using them. You've got to probably practice them for 12, 18 months. And often the practice is not just that, if you like, the content, it's the framework, because by definition, the thinking framework has been constructed to help guide you through a problem-solving process in the right way. So in some sense, I think, there are many, like, if you like, above average thinking processes out there already. They're in every library. They're on Amazon. You can buy books from, well-researched, people. My favorite, Roger, as an example, was the one I just used as an example. And I think, bringing those sorts of things that are already understood by machine to better. But then to your point, you can go better, right? You can actually start to say, well, I wonder who's already got like really good, well-developed heuristics. There's probably a set of people that already have really good. I wonder how we can get them to describe those really good, well-developed heuristics in a way that can be brought to bear with, what I know, what I understand. And that's why I think you start to sit down with the people in your organization and you start to understand that, the tacit knowledge that's in your head, how can you articulate it in a way that actually can be brought to bear through this sort of technology, and made accessible for others to use. And who doesn't want to use the great heuristic that your colleague has that it was previously hard to express and put somewhere, and then equally them have use your really good heuristics as well. Now, there's a caveat to that, right? It forces you got to ask yourself, are your heuristics above average? Which is where I think actually the sort of the performance bar raising, the exciting part of this is, I think it forces us all to really think about what it is we do know well, what we don't know well. I think it also forces us to think about, if the machine can do that as adequately as I can, great, let's have the machine do that. Then I'm going to spend my time doing things that the machine can't do. Yeah, and whether that's thinking, whether that's engaging in relationship discussions, whether that's in other things that are, if you like, uniquely the purvey of humans still. But I think that's really exciting. I don't see, there's lots of concerns about LLMs, if you like, lowering the bar and we all become like a little bit dumber. I don't buy that. I think it's used well. These are exciting things that raise the bar, cause us to think more deeply, more integratively across domains, and actually push us to really engage with other people on the stuff that actually the machine can't get to. So I think that first step is like, probably the most exciting step.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about these really good frameworks and heuristics shaping how people think. And one of the things that I'm doing a lot with folks right now is thinking through what does the AI enabled product development lifecycle look like. And there's a lot of tools out there that are, I view as people having the LLM do their paperwork for them, if you will. Where I think some of the way we work has evolved where it's not sharpening our thinking, and it is, creating paperwork that might serve a purpose, but the way that those documents or artifacts have been structured, it's not forcing people to think differently. An example for me has been product requirements documents, business requirements documents, PRDs, BRDs. I work with a fair number of organizations where that becomes a box that gets checked where people are confusing activity with progress. And so, we started writing LLMs, have LLMs write our PRDs for us. I'm not sure if you've been on the receiving end of some of those, but I have. They're longer than they need to be, and they are just full of words. They're full of way too many features. And what I see in a lot of these documents, whether it's LLM generated or not, is, here's a whole bunch of business benefits. Here's a whole bunch of features with no clear causal link or set of hypotheses or beliefs linking those that is going to drive to a delivery plan. And people read that and they kind of confuse being aligned and clarity of thought with exhaustive documentation versus, for me in the age of AI, like what are we actually trying to accomplish in the requirements definition phase? And how are we trying to sharpen someone's thinking? And what's the mental model we need someone to work through that comes out with a better outcome? And how can an LLM, kind of provide an input to that, which I think is very similar, over the course of a diligence process, for example, of where early on you're really trying to sharpen someone's thought with these heuristics. And if you don't, the LLM is going to produce something very average. And one thing I tell people is, remember the LLMs have been trained to make us happy, not to be right. It wants us to give us an answer where it can go on and do the next thing. It's not agonizing over like, is this perfect? Or they're asking, is it done? And I think that's a key difference as people think about the potential limitations. And to your point, if you don't have that kind of senior person, that human in the loop with a discerning eye, using it properly, it's very easy for bad information to now enter your value chain at the wrong point and continue being passed on if you're not able to see that. And it's not even a hallucination. It's not even wrong information. It's just the wrong way of looking at the information that I think is really key as people think about, to your point, I want to move this to the next conversation, which is what are the implications on these LLMs and on AI human collaboration and what that looks like. So, we've talked a little bit about, what are heuristics? How do we get to that? What is the limitations of data? How can we verify? Turning this to a practical perspective, what have you seen? What have you learned? What's working? What's not working in terms of, places where that human AI relationship is evolving and it's driving true value versus a local optimization, if you will?
I would start with I think to begin with, local optimization is fine. I think actually we're still in the realm of people exploring how it helps them every day for the 5-minute task, the 15-minute task, the 50-minute task. I think that genuinely is great. I think that is an important part of, I guess, getting used to the technology. And remember the capabilities is moving so quick. There's no time for like practices to form, right? What I used to do with O1 Pro in December 2024 became obsolete when, I don't know, deep research came out, was obsolete, after O3 came out, when O3 Pro came out. So I do think it's really important you get that sort of individual productivity engagement with it. But as you said, that's going to lead to a set of in the long run, a set of local optimizations. Whereas actually this sort of technology, I think, can just cause you to completely rethink. I describe, back to that sort of computational constraint. A lot of our workflows, the way we engage, are functions of sort of time and space, and people have to be convened at the same point in time. Whereas actually, I think this allows you to get much more to sort of object-centered. If I've got an investment thesis, or I've got a model, or I've got a portfolio, I can in some sense, think about that as the thing I want to continue to improve, and then bring expertise and bring different perspectives into it. Because in some sense, the bottleneck has always been, in almost every human collaboration, has always been the ability to do structured communication.
Yeah.
That's always been the bottleneck. Yeah. Back to you're talking one language, I'm talking another language, you're talking one dialect of technology, I'm talking another dialect of technology. So I think I'm seeing the most promising results when we just, in a sense, genuinely take a blank sheet of paper and just think, look, what is it we're trying to achieve? Yeah. How would we do this differently given what this technology can do? And we're not subject to the same, if you like, computational constraints as we have been before. Which is why I think some of the debates about, will there be software engineers in the future or not software engineers in the future? And the sort of, the role of vibe coding and the debates have been running probably for the last 3-6 months around that sort of very publicly. Again, it's a bit of the same conversation as, is it intelligent or not? It's the wrong conversation. It's like, is it useful? Can it change the way you work together? Is it going to improve your collaboration or not? That, I think, is where you sort of get into this. So I'll give you like some, really concrete examples. One of my favorite prompts, I made it 2 years ago now. Yeah. I made a prompt that just extracts the beliefs from a document. Does nothing more than that. You put any length of document in. It turns out LLMs are really good at working out whether should, could, would, I believe, I think are basically the same thing as a belief.
Yeah.
So if I want to find out what the 7 things a document is expressing in terms of its beliefs, I put it into this and I get like 7 crisp things, and I get a little view of like what are the logical contradictions in the document, what evidence is presenting. That is a superpower for many conversations. Thank you so much for sending me a 30-page document. There's obviously a lot of things in there, but I think there are 7 things that you are saying that underpin the beliefs in this document. So let's talk about the evidence. Let's talk about the contradictions. Let's talk about the logic, because where you improve your logic is by making your logic clear so other people can debate the logic with you and you can collectively improve it. And I think that's where you really, really need to go on this, like rethink ground up how you are collaborating and communicating and how these tools can help you improve that. Because otherwise you are going to just get an LLM written 30-page document that's actually more verbose, harder to read, less clear than it otherwise would have been. Well, so the people are going to win are the people that are best at expressing intent. That's always been true. And you can use these tools to do that, or not do that. And then you've either got a superpower or not a superpower.
Yeah, and I think, I think this is the point that lands, and specifically as people think about what you just said, the question I'd have people ask themselves is, in a week in their life, in a month in their life, in their role, especially for those in positions that have a lot of strategy work or are making decisions, how much of their time do they spend really examining their underlying beliefs, and how open are they to challenging those? I think there's an aspect too of psychological safety and culture here and specifically the utmost of safety is challenger safety, where people can really challenge beliefs. And that's why I think it goes back to this concept of separating ego from accuracy. And there's so much pride of authorship, of intent. There's such a, we get so caught up in the sunk cost fallacy. And so there's all these anti-patterns of heuristics that we have right now that prevents us from taking advantage of these tools that can contradict us, can present logical fallacies in our thinking, can challenge those. But if I take things one further from what you said as well, it's not only being able to look at what are our existing beliefs, but being able to articulate what would change our. And I think that's where a lot of people and a lot of companies struggle. I see it in my world in product and design and technology, where people go out to do a discovery engagement, or right now, if we're staying on topic, people go and do a AI POC, right? Hey, we're going to test this new AI concept, and they finish it, and then they're trying to make a decision. Do we go to production? And they realized they had absolutely no frame of reference for how they were going to make that decision when they started. So things just get stalled out. Or we go do a big user study or a big market study, and they get to the end of it and people are like, well, 4 out of 10 people like it. Was that enough? Was that what we were shooting for? We were shooting for 6, were we shooting for 7? And I think you and I have talked about this before. A lot of people have a hard time articulating what evidence would change my mind? What evidence would change this belief? Um, and this gets a little bit into the conversation around the value of minimizing surprise versus information gain and navigating ambiguity. And we start to get into the concept of free energy and risk here, which really going to need some footnotes now. But, I think that's the other thing is like, as an organization, if you take one thing away from this today, like how well are articulated and how honest are you about your beliefs and where the uncertainty is in those? And how open are you to being wrong and changing your mind? And are you searching for that evidence, or are you kind of hunkered down in your turtle shell relying on it? I'm curious your thoughts on that, of just from a change management and like psychology perspective. What have you seen so far in terms of people being able to adjust to operate?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine people listening are like, how did you two get to this from large language models, right? And I think maybe for me, like just to like re-emphasize the link, right? But the most transformative technology, the one that like really unlocked civilization, language, but more importantly, writing. Because writing is what continues to allow us to evolve. There's a category theorist, David Spivak, he talks about writing as stabilizing engagement. You ever had a conversation, we form some beliefs out of it, we write it down. Yeah, it's there. At some point later, you and I come back to it, somebody else comes back to it, and they go, wow, that's really interesting, we should talk about that. And they engage this stable written down thing. And that's the way like new stuff gets created, these stepping stones that we've recorded candidly, through history as we've learned to write things down. But it's also the way we formalize our beliefs and express our beliefs, and then we come back to them, we can test them. So there is something genuinely deep between this new technology and how it changes basically our epistemic rhythm, our ability to describe our beliefs, stabilize our beliefs, come back, engage with those beliefs from different perspectives. So I do think actually this is probably in some sense, the most profound technology when it comes to how we form knowledge over time. Now, that's partly because it knows a lot itself, yeah, but it also can transform how we engage amongst one another to do a lot of that knowledge chain and sort of belief definition. If you accept that's how that's how we do this stuff. But then you've got to come with an open mind, right? You've got to actually, and that's hard. Well, let's just be frank, that's hard, right? We often come, even before this technology, we would come into meetings and we'd have a well-polished deck that sort of laid out our thesis. Actually, it was quite hard to see the logic of it. You couldn't quite see what the beliefs really were. You couldn't see what would have to be truths out of that. And then we debate something, and would we get to a conclusion on it? I think you can, really leverage this technology to bring much greater clarity to how you're expressing yourself. You can look at things from many different perspectives as a team, as yourself, just with an individual. You can ask many different perspectives of something. You can test your own thinking in ways that you couldn't do before. And that's why I think it's sort of transformed. But in a sense of, we are back now to the surprise minimization, right? We are surprise minimizing machines ourselves. That's what our brain seeks to do. Yeah, it wants to make sure that our mental model of the world is as close to the way the world works as it can be, so we are not surprised by anything. We have two ways of doing that. We can see the world, update our model to look like the world, or we can go out in the world and take action and try and change the world to look like what our mental model says. You need to do both, but we'll do the minimum energy version of that. And often that is just update our model to just, fit the way we think the world currently works, as opposed to take the action side of that. So I think it's a challenge because we're wired to surprise minimization, and we're wired to do that in a minimum energy way. But nothing great was created by sitting on your hands, right? Nothing great was created by just reading the world and not going and acting in the world. So I think, thinking about where this technology helps and takes us, I think it gives us, I actually think it gives us much more agency to go and do things that we haven't done before, if we choose to use it in that way.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things where I think you've used the term AI helps amplify expertise, where, that's letting us, navigate what you call the transparency uncertainty trade-off. Because I think in all of this, there is an element of analysis paralysis is still possible. And, I think in anything we do, whether it's investment management or whether it's in product development, you can spend unlimited time trying to diligence every company out there. You can spend unlimited time trying to talk to every single one of your users and get 100% data back on your survey and ask them all the questions and completely de-risk something before you act. But there's a cost to that. The last podcast I did talked about discovery as a risk reducing exercise, and discovery has a cost. And so that, I think that's one of the places where humans have their greatest value here and need to leverage this is deciding like when is enough. Like when do I have sufficient evidence to be able to act, and what is the next point at which I need to check in with this hypothesis that might change my mind. And I think that's what helps bridge this kind of generator verifier gap where you talked about this and looking at very long-term investments. There's so many things that are going to impact that structural original thesis you had and the beliefs you had and how you act upon that. Same thing in product development, right? Whether a feature was a good or a bad idea depends a lot on how you continue to iterate on it, how you continue to change it. And so making sure you work in those points where you go back and you're able to re-examine those underlying beliefs and figure out, I might not know if the whole thing I believed was right, but I can figure out if parts of what I believed were right, and being able to update that mental model. And you're still kind of minimizing surprise, but there are a bunch of these little surprises versus a big surprise. One of the terms I've always framed, or one of the terms I've always hated is the concept of failing fast. I like to think about small calculated mistakes, or in today's parlance, it's where are you placing bets, and how are you placing those bets. And so thinking in terms of the things you don't know, of placing a bet, even in the face of uncertainty, is how you move forward. And then looking at an LLM of how do you leverage the LLM to maximize the effectiveness of the bet you want to place, and overcoming that uncertainty while still navigating the trade-off. And so I like where we ended up on this topic, because I think it gives people a practical way to look at, hey, in my day-to-day, am I being honest with my beliefs? Do I understand the ways that I'm making decisions? And am I relying on my own individual weakness, or am I, leveraging the expertise of what's out there and maximizing that? And am I open to changing my mind? Am I seeking the ways to update those beliefs over time to navigate ambiguity, but both investing in information gained without being paralyzed by that uncertainty? And how can an LLM and be worked into my value chain to be able to reorient around that? So how does that sound as a summary point for a takeaway for the audience today?
I think it's perfect. I mean, as you were, you nailed it. I mean, I can't help but sort of, as you were saying it, there were things forming in my head, right? In some sense, we're all going to be able to read the world. The question is, or look at the world in ways that we couldn't do before. And if we all look at the world in the same way, we won't get any value out of it. So the way I look at LLM, or this technology is going to help us look at the world actually in many different ways. If I had one way of looking at it before, I can afford 5 or 6 ways of looking at it now. That gives me new perspectives on how I might think. That's creative and generative. Then the other half of the equation is I need to act in the world based on what based on my interpretation. My belief system might be different. We run heterodox beliefs, right? And that's why we're gonna bet against one another. But then these technologies give me a way of acting in a way that I hadn't had before. They expand the possibilities of things that I could have done. If I couldn't code before, now I can code. I can express my intent. I can. You see that with the small startup teams, very different shapes. So they help us look at the world in ways that we were computationally unable to do before. But we've got to choose to do it, and we've got to choose to sort of use that to update our beliefs. But having done that, we can act in the world in ways that we couldn't done before. And for me, that's like the most fabulous part about this. That's like the empowering part of the technology. I can see the world in many different ways, and I can choose to act in the world in ways I could never have done before. Why wouldn't we want that?
Yeah. And I can't help but respond, because I think the other key underlying that is, if technology lets us look at where we could see something one way and now we can see it 5 ways or 10 ways, I think what separates the people that are going to have the greatest advantage in this space from those that won't, going back to the concept of quality, is, the ones that can really get to the crux of what matters within those different views. And I think that applies across all domains. For example, in product development or risk management, right? If I see a risk log that's 25 items long, I can probably look at it and I can point to the 5 and like, these are going to be what sinks your ship. It's probably going to be a data issue or an auth issue. Those are the normal candidates for syncing a tech project. Same thing. I had a client team share a large PRD or BRD with me recently, and I was able to kind of look at all the feature list, and I was able to find the 2 or 3 that are never going to make it to production. They're going to exceed the cost. They're going to undermeet the value. I could just tell they were concepts they were kind of bolted on, pork barreled in, if you will, and under researched. And so I think that's still one of the big parts of the value is being able to parse, because I'm seeing this already. LLMs like to write longer responses than we might like. I think it goes back to the quote, right? I would have, I think it was Twain. I would have wrote you a shorter letter, but I ran out of time. And I'm already frustrated. I don't know if this happens to you, but when people send out a copy and paste of the Copilot meeting notes, nobody has time to read that. It's really long. And it's longer than any summary email that has ever gone out about a meeting that people will actually read to review it. And so I'm starting to see this of excessive documentation and, just over reliance on it as we go through. So I think that's the other important thing is, making sure as you're developing these tools that they're parsing the information as well and not just overwhelming. And I think that's where we come in still, is being able to develop that expertise and kind of bring that craft in of that. So I know we're coming up on time here. Any other parting thoughts?
Yeah, maybe 2. I mean, one thing I say, if actually above average expertise and, more or less the world's knowledge is at your fingertips, and fabulous capabilities, the ability to code, develop, do other things are at everybody's fingertips. Back to I think I said about the bar raising, right? There's never been a worse time to be average, right? And I think that's great. I think there's never been a worse time to be average, which means we're all going to have to up our game.
Yeah.
I think that's fabulous. I think that's fabulous for everybody. The second thing is I think to some of the things we talked about, where value migrates in the future, I think is also pretty exciting, right? Because I think value migrates, but it's a little bit back to the accuracy and the sort of ego. Maybe there's an IQ and ego version of that, right? So if you want to separate your ego and your IQ, maybe you really need to double down on the EQ side of things, right? I think the ability to have great conversations, engage with people in a very relationship focused way, really get to the heart of the intent of what's being done. Move people to do things they otherwise wouldn't have done. Think about the specifics of your stakeholder reality, your institutional reality, and it plugs into the world. These are like really human things, really always been important, but sometimes we get lost in the analysis and the intellectual part of it, And I'm not saying intellect's going away. There's still an important part of that. But actually that ability to work in the world, to move things, to make things happen that otherwise wouldn't have happened, given that you've set the direction and understood where you want to go, I think that's very exciting about it, because that means we have to double down on the human, the things that we do brilliantly. The stuff that's like unique to us. That I think is exciting as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great place to close. And so, thank you. And I think awesome that we have the chance to think this way. I think obviously, in the world we live in, there's a lot of focus on what's the value we can create in the next quarter. And I think, your position working with a company that thinks over very long time horizons and value creation for a large population over time, I think it grants an opportunity to examine some of these things a little bit more deeply than we're normally able to. So, thank you for the conversation and thank you for the time today. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Jason. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.